Sabrina never imagined that the most important sound at her wedding would be the dry scratch of a pen on paper. There was no music, no flowers, no one holding her hand. The registry office was small, brightly lit, with pale walls that reflected an almost clinical coldness. The clock on the wall read 9 in the morning, but time felt stalled, as if that moment were suspended between before and after. Before we begin, this is not just a story about a marriage of convenience. It's about two people who made an agreement to feel nothing and slowly realized that the hardest rule to follow is the one that forbids the heart. If you enjoy slow-burn romance, emotional tension, and stories that stay with you long after they end, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them the most. Now, let the story begin. She sat on a hard chair, feeling the simple fabric of her dress brush against her skin. It wasn't white, it wasn't special, it was just appropriate, just like everything about that day. Across the table, Daniel remained still. Dark suit, perfectly aligned tie, impeccable posture. He looked far too comfortable in that setting, like someone who knew exactly where he was and why he was there. There was no hesitation in his movements, no doubt in his eyes, only control. Sabrina tried not to look at him for too long. Every time their eyes met, she felt something strange in her chest. Not emotion, but awareness. The clear realization that this man, practically a stranger, was about to become the closest person in her life, at least on paper. "Please sign here," the clerk said in a neutral tone, sliding the documents across the desk. Sabrina picked up the pen. For a second, her fingers hesitated, not out of regret, but because of the weight of the gesture. That signature would change everything, even if, technically, it changed nothing. She wrote her name carefully. Each letter felt slower than usual, as if her body were trying to buy time. When she finished, a slight tightness settled in her chest, a quiet emptiness. It wasn't sadness, it was clarity. Daniel signed immediately after. No pause, no hesitation. "I now declare you legally married," the clerk said. "I wish you happiness." The word echoed strangely in the room. Happiness. Daniel closed the folder with the documents and stood up first. "Thank you," he replied politely. Sabrina stood as well. They faced each other for a moment, too brief to be intimate, too long to be meaningless. Daniel extended his hand. She shook it. The gesture was correct, cold, professional. Neither of them smiled. That handshake was the perfect summary of what they had just done. Moo? Sabrina had always believed she could manage on her own. Not because life had been easy, but because she had learned far too early that depending on someone was dangerous. People left. Circumstances changed. Promises broke. She had built a simple, predictable routine, a small apartment, a job that paid the bills, few luxuries, few risks. Until the phone rang that afternoon, the call was short, direct, cruelly objective. The treatment needed to continue. The costs had increased. The deadline was limited. When she hung up, Clara remained standing in the middle of the living room, her phone still in her hand. The silence felt heavier than usual. The world hadn't ended, but something inside her had cracked. She sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, feeling the weight of reality settle in slowly. She didn't cry right away. First came the calculations, the bills, the possibilities. Then the realization there was no easy way out. In the days that followed, Clara lived on autopilot. She smiled when necessary, worked as usual, slept little, thought too much. It was in that state that she received an unusual invitation for an interview, arranged by someone she barely knew, Daniel. They met at a discreet cafe, far from the places he usually frequented. Nothing flashy, nothing intimate, neutral ground. Daniel arrived exactly on time. "Thank you for coming," he said, sitting across from her. Clara nodded, studying him carefully. He looked like someone used to being listened to, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be taken seriously. "I'll be direct," he continued. "I need to get married." She blinked, surprised. "I'm sorry." "What?" Daniel kept his expression calm. "A formal marriage, legal, with a contract, public appearances when necessary, no emotional expectations." Sabrina laughed nervously. "Are you serious?" "I am." He explained everything with surgical precision: the company, the board, the public image, the requirement for stability. Sabrina listened in silence, trying to understand where she fit into all of it. Then he explained what she would receive. The number was high, higher than anything she had ever imagined having. Her heart raced. "Why me?" she asked, suspicious. Daniel looked at her for a few seconds before answering. "Because you're not part of my circle. Because you don't seem interested in what isn't being offered. And because..." He paused, almost imperceptibly. "You seem practical." She remained silent. "There are rules," he continued. "The main one is simple." Daniel took a breath before saying it. "No feelings." The words hung in the air. Sabrina thought about everything she needed to fix, everything that was at stake, everything she was already losing. 2 years, she said. "After that, we go our separate ways." "Exactly." She extended her hand. "Then we have a deal." Daniel shook it. The house was far too big for someone like Sabrina, too quiet, too organized, too impersonal. On the first night, she walked through the hallways like a visitor. Each step echoed softly, reminding her that this place was not truly hers. Daniel showed her the bedroom. "If you need anything, let me know," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "The house is yours too. Let's just keep things simple." Sabrina nodded. "Simple is what I know how to do." During the first few days, they barely saw each other. Daniel left early, came back late. Sabrina filled her time trying not to feel out of place. She organized things that were already organized, prepared simple meals, watched television without really paying attention. At night, they sometimes crossed paths in the kitchen. Good night. Good night. Nothing more than that. But the silence wasn't empty. Sabrina began to notice details too small to matter, yet they did. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the habit of taking off his watch when he came home, the way he kept a respectful distance. Daniel, in turn, noticed something unexpected. The house felt less cold with Sabrina there. Soft music in the late afternoons. A different smell of coffee in the mornings. A presence that took up space without intruding. He didn't comment. He simply felt it, and that made him uneasy. The first crack appeared on an ordinary night. Sabrina was sitting on the couch reading when Daniel walked by and stopped for a moment. "Are you going out tomorrow?" he asked. "Maybe. Why?" "We have a dinner with some board members. It would be good if you came." She closed the book. "Of course." Daniel hesitated. "You don't have to feel pressured." "I know exactly the role I agreed to," she replied calmly. At the dinner, Sabrina was perfect, polite, discreet, natural, and Daniel noticed the looks, the comments, the way she moved with confidence in a space that wasn't truly hers. Something uncomfortable tightened in his chest. Pride? Jealousy? He pushed the thought away, no feelings. But that night, lying in bed, Daniel realized something unsettling. The rule no longer felt that simple. Decision. What began to change between Sabrina and Daniel wasn't something that could be clearly identified. There was no specific moment, no forbidden touch, no misplaced confession. It was the routine. Sabrina realized this one ordinary morning when she walked into the kitchen still half asleep and found the coffee maker already on. The smell of fresh coffee filled the quiet space. Daniel had already left, but he had left the cup by the sink exactly the way he always did. She stood there for a few seconds, staring at that simple object as if it were a sign. He had been there. He had thought about coffee. He was part of her routine now. Sabrina turned off the coffee maker and poured herself a cup. Only then did she notice she had prepared two. She stared at the second cup for a moment that lasted too long. "Idiot," she murmured to herself, pouring the coffee down the sink. But the gesture had already been made, and so had the thought. The days began to take on a different rhythm. Daniel still left early and came home late, but now, for some inexplicable reason, their schedules began to align more often. Sometimes they met in the hallway, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the living room, each pretending to be too busy to notice the other. "Good night," he would say. "Good night," she would reply. But there was something new in those brief encounters: attention. Daniel noticed when Sabrina looked tired, when her smile was smaller, when her silence lasted longer. Sabrina noticed when he came home with tense shoulders, when his tie was loosened just enough, when he seemed to carry the weight of the entire day in his eyes. Neither of them said anything, but both of them felt it. Sabrina began leaving soft music playing in the afternoons, nothing loud, just a background sound to break the silence of the house. Daniel noticed, but didn't ask her to turn it off. On the contrary, he started coming home a little earlier on those days. He wouldn't admit it, but the music made the house feel less impersonal, less empty. And kinks at night, alone in her room, Sabrina became aware of something disturbing. She thought about Daniel far too often. Not in a romantic way, she told herself, just curiosity, observation, coexistence. But the body didn't lie. Her heart raced when she heard his car pulling into the driveway. She felt an odd frustration when he didn't come down for dinner. Relief when she saw him walk through the door, even without exchanging a single word. It scared her. She had accepted that marriage precisely because she believed she could separate reason from emotion. She always had, strong, practical, controlled. So why did it feel so difficult now? Daniel was fighting a silent battle of his own. During long meetings and strategic discussions, his mind drifted to thoughts that didn't belong there. He wondered if Sabrina had eaten, if she was tired, if she had spent too much time alone in that oversized house. He grew irritated with himself. It didn't make sense. It wasn't productive. It wasn't safe. Feelings were weaknesses he had learned to avoid very early in life. And yet there he was, distracted by someone who was never meant to be more than an agreement. The invitation to the board dinner came as something inevitable. "We'll need to go together," Daniel said one afternoon, reviewing some papers in the living room. "It's important to maintain a stable image." Sabrina nodded. Of course. She said it naturally, but inside she felt a slight tightening. It wasn't fear, it was expectation, and that bothered her. On the night of the dinner, Sabrina got ready carefully, without excess. She chose a discreet, elegant dress, not attention-grabbing, but quietly confident. She pinned her hair back simply and lingered in front of the mirror a second longer than usual. When she came downstairs, Daniel was already waiting. He looked up and fell silent for a brief moment. "You look appropriate," he said, choosing his words carefully. Sabrina gave a small smile. "That's the idea." During the dinner, Sabrina played her role perfectly. She spoke when addressed, listened attentively, answered with intelligence. She didn't try to impress, and that was exactly why she did. Daniel noticed the looks, men paying too much attention, subtle comments, poorly hidden interest. He tried to ignore it, but something inside him tightened with every new interaction. When one of the guests lightly touched Sabrina's arm while saying goodbye, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Jealousy. The realization was almost offensive. He tightened his grip on the glass, forcing his expression to remain neutral. "She's not yours," he reminded himself. "This is an agreement." But his body didn't obey logic. Breeze. The drive home was silent. Sabrina watched the city lights through the window, feeling a strange mix of physical exhaustion and emotional restlessness. She had noticed Daniel's behavior throughout the evening. The rigidity, the overly attentive gaze, the restrained silence. "Are you okay?" she finally asked. Daniel took a moment before answering. "I am." But the tone didn't convince even himself. When they arrived, he turned off the car and remained still for a few seconds. "Sabrina," he began without looking at her, "we need to talk." Her heart sped up. "About what?" "About boundaries," he said. "We're getting too comfortable." "That wasn't the agreement." Sabrina took a deep breath. "I know." "We need to reinforce the rule," he continued. "We can't allow this to evolve." She nodded slowly. "All right." But something in the way she said it sounded final, painful. They went inside in silence. After that conversation, something shifted. Daniel started coming home even later. Sabrina began going out more, inventing commitments she didn't really have. They avoided sharing spaces, avoided unnecessary conversations, but avoidance didn't erase anything. Sabrina missed the quiet coffees, the brief encounters in the kitchen, the simple comfort of knowing he was nearby. Daniel missed her discreet presence filling the house. The low music, the smell of coffee in the afternoon, the rule once rational, now hurt. Every avoided gesture felt like a loss, too small to explain, too big to ignore. One night, Sabrina sat on the couch until late, pretending to read but actually waiting. When Daniel finally walked in, exhausted, he found her there. "You're still awake?" "I am." They looked at each other for a few seconds that lasted too long. "Are you okay?" he asked, almost against his own will. Sabrina took a breath. "I don't know." The honesty slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel took a few steps toward her, then stopped, as if an invisible line separated them. "Sabrina." "The rule," she said softly, "is starting to hurt." The weight of her words settled heavily in his chest. And still, he didn't respond, because admitting that would mean crossing a line there might be no return from. And to the silence between them was no longer empty, it was too full. They were in the same room, separated by only a few steps, and an entire ocean of thoughts neither of them seemed willing or brave enough to cross. She pretended to read, he pretended to work on his phone, but something else was happening there. She felt his presence like a magnetic field. She didn't need to look to know he was there. Just the sound of his breathing, low, controlled, was enough to keep her alert, awake, exposed. When had everything changed so much? In the beginning, it had all been simple. An agreement, a marriage of convenience, a rational plan to solve practical problems. No feelings, no expectations, no promises beyond what was written and what would never be said. But now her body reacted before reason. She turned a page without absorbing a single word. Her mind was too far away, trapped in recent memories. The brief touch in the hallway, the way he watched her when he thought she didn't notice, the excessive care disguised as indifference. He felt it too. He tried to deny it, but he did. When had he started noticing the way she tied her hair when she was nervous, or how she furrowed her brow when she thought too much, or her silence, which said far more than any speech? He closed his phone and rested his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. This was slipping out of control. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was a man used to planning every step, every decision, every consequence. And yet, there he was, afraid afraid to admit the obvious, afraid to cross the invisible line they had drawn together. "Are you okay?" Her voice broke the silence, soft, almost too careful. He lifted his gaze slowly. His heart stumbled when he met her eyes. There was something there, something new, something that hadn't existed at the beginning. "I am," he said after a second longer than necessary. "And you?" She hesitated, just a little, enough to reveal that the question didn't have a simple answer. "I'm learning how to be." He understood more than she imagined. Learning how to exist in that strange space where the agreement was no longer enough, but the feeling still had no name. They smiled, a small, restrained, almost sad smile. "This is harder than it looks," he said quietly. She nodded. "Especially when you promise you won't feel anything, and you do anyway." The air grew heavy, dense, too honest. He stood and walked slowly to the window, as if he needed distance to think. Hands in his pockets, gaze lost in the city outside. "We agreed this wouldn't happen," he said, without turning around. "I know," she replied, "but no one made a deal with the heart." He closed his eyes for a moment. That sentence hit deep because it was exactly that. There was no clause, no contract, no logic that could prepare someone for when the heart decided to act on its own. "I don't want to hurt you," he finally said, turning to face her, "or myself." She stood as well. Now they were facing each other, not too close. There was still a safe space between them, a last refuge. "And I don't want to be just a functional part of your life," she said with quiet firmness. "I want to be whole, or not at all." He swallowed hard. She had never asked for anything, never demanded, never pressured. And yet, that silent request was the most honest thing anyone had ever asked of him. "Maybe," he began, and stopped. Maybe what? Maybe they should stop. Maybe they should continue. Maybe it was already too late for either option. She sensed his hesitation and, for the first time, took a step forward. Just one, small, but enough to change everything. "You don't have to decide now," she whispered. "Just don't pretend you don't feel anything." He lifted his hand as if to touch her, then stopped halfway. The suspended gesture said more than any touch could. "I do feel it," he confessed, "and that's what scares me the most." She smiled, a calm, understanding smile. There was no victory there, only truth. "Then we're in the same place." They stayed like that for a few seconds. The world outside kept moving. Time continued. But inside that room, everything felt suspended. Before either of them could say more or do something irreversible, she stepped back. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he replied. She left the room without looking back. If she had, she might not have had the strength to leave. He remained there, standing still, realizing for the first time in a long while that control was no longer in his hands. And strangely, that didn't feel entirely bad, because what came next, he knew, would no longer be about convenience. It would be about choice. And some choices change everything. They no longer remembered exactly when the agreement had started to fail. Maybe it was the day she realized he knew the time she arrived home without ever checking the clock. Or the night he left a cup of tea on the table, exactly the way she liked it, without saying a single word. The contract still existed. The marriage was still, technically, one of convenience, but something had changed, quietly. And the silence now weighed more than any argument ever could. She noticed it first. It was always like that. She noticed when she began waiting for the sound of his key in the door, when she felt a strange discomfort seeing him smile at his phone, reading messages that weren't from her, when she started choosing clothes while wondering if he would notice, and she hated herself for it, because the agreement was clear. No feelings, no expectations, no pain. She repeated it like a mantra whenever her heart raced without permission. He, on the other hand, took longer to admit it. For him, everything had started as a practical arrangement. A functional marriage, without emotional risks, without promises that could break. But he found himself paying attention to details that shouldn't matter, and yet held him captive. The way she frowned when she was thinking, the habit of walking barefoot around the house even when it was cold, the comfortable silence that formed when they were together without needing to speak. None of that was part of the plan. And yet, there it was. Dalsiyuzn. The first real conflict didn't come as a fight. It came as denied jealousy. She arrived home later that night. Not much later, just enough to break the routine they had created without realizing it. He was sitting on the couch, lights low, pretending to read something he wasn't absorbing. He looked up when she entered. "You're late." His tone was too neutral to be casual. "I had some things to take care of," she said, slipping off her shoes. Silence. She felt the weight of that silence on her back as she walked toward the bedroom. It wasn't accusation, it was worse. It was expectation. "Are you going out tomorrow?" he asked, as if it were a harmless question. "Maybe." Another pause. In that moment, she realized they were stepping into forbidden territory. Questions that shouldn't matter, answers that were no longer automatic. She turned to face him. "Is this turning into an interrogation?" He shook his head too quickly. "No, just curiosity." Curiosity. The word sounded false, even to him. For that week, the house felt smaller. They brushed past each other in the hallways, sat too close at the table, avoided eye contact for too long. Everything felt wrong because it felt too right. Until something external happened. A call, an invitation, an opportunity that hadn't been part of the plan. She received the offer on an ordinary afternoon. A change that meant distance, personal growth that shouldn't require anyone's permission. She should have told him immediately, but she didn't. She kept the news like a fragile secret, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps hoping she wouldn't have to say anything at all. He sensed it before he knew. He noticed it in her distracted movements, in the way her gaze always seemed far away, in how she started organizing things she had never touched before. "You're leaving," he said one night without hesitation. She froze. "How do you know?" "I don't know," he said. "I feel it." The words slipped out before he could stop them. They stared at each other. In that instant, the agreement truly began to crack. "That's not part of the deal," she said, trying to regain control. "Neither of us has to explain anything." "I know," he replied, "but pretending it doesn't matter isn't part of it either." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was heavy, dense, irreversible. And the decision started to take shape there, unspoken, unclaimed, but present. She began to wonder if she was running away, or simply following the original plan. He began to wonder when he had allowed this to stop being just an agreement. And maybe for the first time, they were both afraid. Afraid of losing something they were never allowed to want. And the night everything almost collapsed arrived without warning. A small argument, a misunderstood comment, accumulated exhaustion. "You act like you've already left," he said. "And you act like you have some right over it," she shot back, defensive. The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. "Maybe I do," he said quietly. She laughed, without humor. "No, you don't. Neither of us does." That was when he pulled away. Not physically. Emotionally, he started coming home later, speaking less, honoring the agreement with a coldness that hurt more than any demand. She realized it too late, when the house felt like nothing more than a shared space, when the silence stopped being comforting and became empty. And for the first time, she wondered if there was still time. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the contract, the offer, the things they had never dared to name, and for the first time since it all began, she was afraid of losing something real, something that was never promised, never allowed, and yet existed. In the room next door, he was awake too, wondering if he should leave first, if he should protect himself before it was too late, if pretending indifference was still possible, and with painful clarity, he knew the next step would change everything. The agreement was already broken. All that was missing was the courage to admit it. The morning arrived strangely calm. There was no argument, no goodbye, just his absence in the kitchen, the untouched cup on the counter, the empty space in the chair he always used. She understood before she even needed confirmation. He had pulled away, not because he didn't feel, but because he felt too much. The house, which once felt small, now echoed. Every step she took sounded louder than it should. Every object seemed to carry a memory too recent to ignore. She tried to convince herself it was the right thing. It was the agreement. It was the original plan. But the body doesn't obey logic. The silence hurt in a different way, not like loneliness, but like anticipated loss. He spent the day away, walking without direction, sitting in places that didn't matter, trying to organize thoughts that refused to stay in order. The mistake hadn't been falling in love. The mistake had been pretending it wasn't happening. He remembered the beginning, the practical way everything had been arranged, the neutral tone they used when talking about limits, the relief they both felt knowing no one would get hurt, naive, because no one walks away untouched once they begin to belong, even without realizing it. He thought about leaving for good, ending everything before it became irreversible. But something stopped him. An uncomfortable certainty that if he left now, he wouldn't be protecting himself, he would be denying himself. She tried to work. She couldn't. The words on the screen made no sense. The hours passed without meaning. Her mind always returned to the same place, what had been left unsaid. Her fear wasn't separation, it was cowardice. She realized she had confused independence with escape, that she had used the agreement as a shield, that she had treated feeling as a threat when it was actually an invitation. When she finally looked at her phone and saw his message, simple, direct, her heart raced. "We need to talk." Nothing else. No emoji, no explanation. But it was enough. As they met in the late afternoon, in the same place where they had signed the contract months earlier. Cruel irony. They sat across from each other, separated by a distance that no longer existed emotionally, only physically. He spoke first. "I thought about leaving." She swallowed hard. "I figured. I thought it might be easier." "And was it?" He looked at her. There was no accusation in his eyes, only truth. "No." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. She took a deep breath. "I received an offer," she said at last. "A big change." "I know. I should have told you sooner." "You should have." Neither of them raised their voice. There was no anger there, only poorly managed fear. "Are you going to accept it?" he asked. She hesitated. For the first time, she allowed herself to hesitate. "I don't know anymore." That changed everything. He leaned forward slightly. "I don't want to be the reason you stay. And I don't want you to be the reason I leave," she replied, with unexpected firmness. She felt the weight of her own courage in that moment. "But I also don't want to keep pretending this isn't real." He closed his eyes for a second, as if that sentence was exactly what he needed to hear, and what he feared most. "When we made the agreement," he said. "I thought I was protecting myself. But I was just postponing the inevitable." "Me too." She clenched her hands as if she needed something physical to hold on to in order to continue. "I don't know when it started. I don't know how. I just know that I miss you when you pull away. That I care when I shouldn't. That I'm afraid of losing something we never officially had." He opened his eyes. "We did have it," he said. "We just pretended we didn't." The words landed like undeniable truth. And there were no dramatic declarations, no unrealistic promises. There was honesty. He spoke about his fear of depending. She spoke about her fear of belonging. They both admitted they had confused control with safety. "I don't want an agreement anymore," he said finally. "I want a choice." She took a deep breath. "Then choose with me," she replied. It was that simple. Nothing cinematic, nothing rehearsed. The choice didn't erase their fears, but it made it possible to face them together. She declined the offer days later, not because of him, but for herself. He didn't ask her to stay. She didn't ask him to change. They adjusted their lives the way people do when they're learning to dance, without stepping on each other so much. There was still silence. But now it was comfortable again. There was still fear, but there was also intention. That night, sitting on the couch, not speaking for long minutes, she rested her head on his shoulder. He didn't move. He just stayed. And in that simple gesture, without contract, without rules, without conditions, they understood that love hadn't emerged despite the agreement. It had emerged because at some point they chose to stop running. Sometimes what begins as convenience ends as choice, and that is what changes everything. Until the end, more stories are already on the way. See you in the next chapter.